Google Meet side, you're welcome to join us on LinkedIn Live. Just go to Adaptive Challenge Consulting and open it up, and you'll see the live broadcast. That chat is the active chat. And so if you're interested in contributing, you can offer things in chat here on the Google side, Google Meet side, but I don't always catch those. So yeah, if you do have questions, and today's session, I think there might be some questions. Today's session is going to be a little bit different from the last few, but I'll do that setup shortly. And so let me just verify that we are on LinkedIn Live. There's always a little delay, but I think we're about there. Enjoy a sip of coffee from my Mickey Mouse coffee mug. Everybody's curious. I'm drinking from the Mickey Mouse. There we go. We are live on LinkedIn. We are live on Facebook. We are live on Google Meet. So we are all over the place today. And that's not a metaphor for how organized or disorganized I am. That means we're broadcasting all over the place. So I see, okay, we're building our audience on LinkedIn Live. That is great. Welcome to those of you on LinkedIn Live. We are simulcasting this on Google Meet. So bear with us just a second. The Google Meet, we already have a few people in there. So welcome, Google Meet, folks. You know, it's interesting. I'm going to waste time while we build our audience for like one more minute. I think the Google Meet folks have a different view of my office, and they can see more fun stuff over here. And the LinkedIn Live folks see the more serious parts of my background over here. And so I suspect that the people on the Google Meet think I'm more fun. Maybe. The people on LinkedIn think I'm more serious. I don't know. But the background communicates, I guess. But the Google Meet folks can see some remnants of my career in student activities when I was doing activities stuff. So it's very colorful, and I think there's a poster back there of a community theater production I was in. Yeah. All right. It is after 12 o'clock. So we are going to go ahead and get this thing started. For those of you on the LinkedIn Live, you're about to see a share screen. So bear with me 1 second here. And there we go. Here it is. And I'm going to make the shared screen bigger and me smaller so you can see what's going on. So welcome, everyone, to this next part of our series on leading with emotional intelligence. If you're new to this conversation, Leading with Emotional Intelligence is my new book. I'm very proud of it. I spent 20 some odd years in academia, and through that process did a dissertation, which you have to publish, got a few journal articles published, nothing super serious because I'm not an academic deep down in my bones, but I did go through the editorial process and get some things published. But this book is me. This book is everything I've read about leadership in academic circles. This is everything I've read about management in academic circles, but this is also 25 years, 30 years of doing leadership development. And I've probably, of those 25 or 30 years, I think probably about 18 of those years I was focusing on college students. And about 12 of those years I've been focusing on people in the working world. And so my company, Adaptive Challenge Consulting, we work with city governments, county governments, K-12 systems, K-12 schools, universities, colleges, corporations. So anybody who needs to advance their leadership development goals. And so one of our taglines is that we approach this with authenticity, and also we approach this with humor, and also we approach this with inclusion. And I think if we start with authenticity, if we occasionally lean on humor, and if we focus on inclusion, I think our workplaces will get better. So let's get into today's slideshow. Today, we're going to be talking about personality type in leadership. Real quick, I think that folks know this who've been to any of my sessions, is that we always pause and mention that we all have different identities, right? And that all of our identities go with us wherever we want to go. So even though today we're talking about personality, I cannot pretend that when we're talking about personality that gender is not here, that race is not here, that ability status, disability status is not here. All of those things are here with us all the time. And so if we're going to have a conversation about extroversion and introversion and how that can impact leadership, or the second letter of the Myers-Briggs, sensing and intuition, and how that can help make you a better leader and equip you for better leadership, I can't talk about those things in a vacuum. So I always share that is a reality, and it just is what it is. And again, many of you, just like I have and many members of my team have gone through DEI workshops, diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops, belonging workshops, etc. And my team does that. But what we're more known for is just, we're going to have a conversation about leadership. We're going to do training about communication. We're going to do training about active listening. We're going to do training about how to work effectively as a team and manage across difference. And those principles from those other workshops are just woven throughout what we do. So that's what this slide is meant to share. What I'm inviting you to do is shift your perspective. Whenever I do keynotes, I love sharing this graphic, which is the FedEx arrow. I'm in Central North Carolina, and FedEx has a large presence here. And when I do keynote speeches, I love this moment because about 25% of every audience to whom I deliver a keynote speech has never seen that in the negative space between the E and the X, there's an arrow. There's an arrow. And so I always get to blow the minds of 25% of every audience. Sometimes it's a little bit more than that. I share this again to say, I hope you get some aha moments in this webinar that you can never aha, if that makes sense. Trust me when I say, if today's the first day you saw the FedEx arrow, you're gonna be driving down the highway, see a FedEx truck, there it is again. You're gonna get a package, there it is again. Once you've seen it, you'll never unsee it. For blind members of the community, another example is the Wilhelm scream. And if you don't know the Wilhelm scream, look it up on YouTube. Trust me when I say, everyone on this call has heard the Wilhelm scream between 50 and 300 times. And until you're made aware that it is the Wilhelm scream, you don't know. But then when you know, forevermore, when you hear that scream in a movie, you're going to know it was the Wilhelm scream. So today we're going to be talking about personality and leading with emotional intelligence. And you may notice, if you've been on some of my other sessions, you may notice in the little icon, and I think this is only on the LinkedIn Live side, but I have a little icon on the LinkedIn Live side that's not referencing my book this time, but it's referencing my online course. And so my book does have a chapter about this, and I think it's a good chapter, but it can only go so deep. And so I even mentioned in that chapter, for people who are curious about Jungian psychology, the Myers-Briggs, which is one of the most popular iterations of Jungian psychology, and more importantly, how you can use a better understanding of these dichotomies that Jung presents to be a more effective leader. If you want to know that, then the course is the better way to go. The book is going to give you a scratching of the surface, because I feel like there are certain concepts that I wanted to introduce in the book about when you're leading humans, and humans come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. So we have, an intercultural chapter, and then we have a psychology chapter. But if this conversation gets you curious, check out my course. And also, I'll just be honest, when I started the course, it was the first online course I offered. I looked at the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom was price your course at $229. I tried that. I sold a couple. Then I reduced it to $129. And then when my book came out, I thought, my book started selling very quickly. And so I thought, I need to reduce the price of this course so more people can do it. And now it's $40. And so it's great, self-paced. But so here we go. These are the four dichotomies, the Myers-Briggs. Many of you are probably familiar with these: extrovert, introvert, intuitive sensing, feeling, thinking, and perceiving, judging. One of the things that's most critical to understand is that the Myers-Briggs is not an aptitude test. The Myers-Briggs is not telling you how good you are at anything. It is a test about preferences, what your preferences are. I like those kinds of instruments more. And this is not, I'm not throwing shade at StrengthsFinder or DISC or any other assessments. But what I'm saying is that if I took an assessment and the assessment asked me, Alan, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good of a dancer are you? And then the next question was, Alan, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good of a driver are you? And then the next question was, Alan, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good of a singer are you? I might put down a number that's based on my belief about my skill in each of those things, but we could objectively prove whether I had skills in those things. And maybe my opinion of how good of a dancer, driver, or singer I am is not based in the reality of other people who see me driving, hear me singing, or watch me dancing, right? So aptitude tests are inherently more tricky to construct, but preferences, trust me when I say, if there was a survey that asked me on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do I like coffee? That's easy to answer. It's 10. So I got a little meta there with my coffee. So this is all about preferences. Keep in mind that I have a preference for right-handedness, for example. I'm right-handed. You may have noticed I picked up my coffee cup with my left hand. This is one of the misconceptions of the Myers-Briggs that I want to just clear up real quickly before we get into the aspects of how it can increase our leadership capacity and our emotionally intelligent leadership capacity. Understand that if you have an extrovert preference, that means when all other things are equal, you prefer to energize from the outside. But all other things aren't always equal. Sometimes from the outside is a large group of people that aren't really your people. And maybe you're an intuitive person or a feeler in the Myers-Briggs, and finding your people is why you socialize. And if you're around people who you think are clearly not your people, the extroversion isn't going to present in the same way. That preference isn't going to show up in the same way because there are other preferences that make us us, right? Other preferences that make you you. Meanwhile, in lots of companies that I work with, people always sell short folks with introvert preferences, and often say, well, people with introvert preferences, they can't do this or they can't do that or whatever. Stop doing that, friends. Stop doing that. I'm right-handed. It doesn't mean I can't use my left hand. Now, if I wrote a 2-page essay by hand, one right-handed, and then wrote another 2-page essay by hand, one left-handed, one would be easier to read. But that's because my preference for right-handedness has built into skill over time. It's not the same as skill. And that's a huge distinction on when we're talking about Jungian psychology, preference, and the Myers-Briggs, is that your preference is your preference. Your preference can lead to opportunities to build skills, but then people mistake, oh, extroverts are good at this and introverts are good at that. And so I'm drawing this distinction here because it's important once we start talking about our colleagues, once we start thinking about how to work across difference. Because if I'm going to say, if I'm a manager and regularly we do presentations to customers or clients or students or constituents or whomever, and I believe that the introverted members of my staff can't do that, I'm going to rob them of those leadership opportunities. A better way to understand it is if I have people on my staff who need to do some public presenting, need to be in a very fast-paced environment with a lot of people, and I know that staff member has an introvert preference, I just need to, as the manager, number one, support them, make sure they've got enough prep time. Number two, when they finish that big presentation, don't schedule 2 staff meetings right after it, but schedule some downtime for their office so they can recharge. Similarly, people with an extrovert preference, if they have a task that they have to do that's going to be tedious and boring and require them to be on a spreadsheet for 2.5 to 3 days in their office, don't tell them they can't do it. Of course they can do it, but be intentional. Build in some coffee breaks for them. Suggest to them that they go out to lunch both of those days. When the project is finished, see if you can get them to something social at work or something like that. So this is simply about helping support different members of your team and understanding those preferences, but those preferences do not limit our skill. The preferences can lead to skill, but they don't limit our skill. So let's talk about this from a leadership vantage point. Introvert extrovert dichotomy. And I was just doing a workshop with a business here in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's a business that makes flavors. It's a cool business. Every time I go there, the smells are very, very robust. And so one of the skills that I'm talking about with their management and leadership team is the skill of active listening, and then the skill of making other people feel heard. These are 2 entirely different skills. I can sit and actively listen to someone and really, really absorb what they're saying, but also not give them any clues that I have heard what they're saying, which means I'm not making them feel heard as I'm doing the listening. So these are 2 distinct skill sets that leaders need to develop, have to have. But oftentimes we conflate them, we confuse them, we pretend they're the same thing, and they're not the same thing. When we think about introvert preference and extrovert preference, and if you're in the chat on the LinkedIn side, if you want to take a guess here, you can. But if you're thinking about someone like me who does these trainings, and I'm having to teach leaders and managers how to do active listening better, how to develop the skill of active listening, which group of preference folks do you think might have a slight edge in learning to actively listen? Do you think it's people with an introvert preference or people with an extrovert preference? Along those lines, because I'm teaching all leaders and all managers about actively listening and then making people feel heard, When I'm teaching that second skill set about making people feel heard, do you think one group of preference type might have a slight edge in expressing and making other people feel heard once they've done the listening part? So essentially, people with an introvert preference have a slightly easier time learning to build active listening as a skill. Not all people with introvert preferences are great listeners. Sorry, introverts. I'm sorry I'm giving away your dirty laundry or whatever, giving them the inside scoop. But sometimes your extroverts, when you're talking to your introvert colleagues, half the time they're just like, oh wow, I can't wait to see what happens on Severance later, or what am I making for dinner, or oh, I'm so excited to hang out with my best friend later, or whatever. They're in their own little world. Like I can't wait to read chapter 7 of the book I'm on. So sorry, introverts, to kind of air your dirty laundry, but extroverts assume all introverts are good listeners, and it's 50-50. And listening and active listening is a skill that you can build. Extroverts think all introverts are good at it because they're not talking as much, they're not interrupting as much. And extroverts believe that that means they are listening more. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. So when it comes to teaching the skill of active listening, people with introvert preferences have a little bit of a head start, right? It doesn't mean they're good at it automatically. It doesn't mean they're going to be better at it eventually. It just means they have a little bit of a head start. It's a less steep hill to climb in terms of the learning. Meanwhile, on the other side of the equation, people with extrovert preferences tend to struggle more with the learning to active listening part, because people with extrovert preferences tend to interject in conversations to build community, to build connection, to try to relate. There's all of these things happening in people with extrovert preferences minds that are why we always interject in conversations and that kind of thing, right? But when it comes to the second skill that I'm mentioning, the making people feel heard, people with extrovert preferences have a little bit of a head start on that, in part because people with extrovert preferences use a lot of nonverbal cues. Now, not everybody you work with is attuned to nonverbal cues, and that's okay. But extroverts also, people with extrovert preferences also use straight up overtly verbal cues, right? And so keep in mind that people with extrovert preferences, because of body language, because of what they say, are usually able to learn the skill of making people feel heard more quickly. Give you a real life example. I do surveys. We have something in Adaptive Challenge Consulting called the ACC 10-factor assessment. And this is an assessment I built after years and years of working with clients. And the cool thing that I love is I get to give it to leaders or managers and those they manage, right? And so some people might call this a 360 assessment, but the bottom line is that the leaders, the managers, get to rate themselves on 10 key leadership dynamics. They get to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 5. And then everyone they supervise also gets to rate them, also gets to give them a ranking. So, for example, if the dynamic is intercultural competence, to what degree is my manager interculturally competent? The manager may give themselves a 3 out of 5, thinking I'm not very interculturally competent. Those they manage may give them a 4 out of 5, and that average might be a 4 out of 5. And in those instances, I call that a humility gap, right? Where there is a gap, but it's a good kind of gap. Your leader knows that they have work to do or believes they have work to do, but the team sees the work and is aware, whatever. Here's something that's interesting, and this is why I love using an instrument that's Jungian-based, something like the Myers-Briggs, and there's a few others as well that are based in Jungian psychology. Why I love working with this tool in conjunction with that ACC 10-factor assessment is that every time I see a manager who has an introvert preference, if I have the privilege of knowing their type, if they have an introvert preference, and of the 10 people they supervise, 8 of those who they supervise have an extrovert preference, I can go ahead and tell you that when asked, how effective is your leader or manager at communicating, I can already tell you that it's not going to be as good. It's not going to be, the manager's not going to be perceived as communicating enough by people with extrovert preferences, overwhelmingly, over and over and over again. So the reason I do these things together is because this doesn't discount what we learned from the 10-factor leadership assessment. That doesn't discount that at all. But what that does do is it makes sure that that there's flavor, that there's an added dimension, that there's extra understanding around why the supervisees might rate the supervisor in a certain way. And so bear with me 1 second. My laptop's about to die. So I'm going to plug it in. All right, Google Meet people, you were about to be on a laptop that was going to tell me we were out of juice. Oh, and maybe that was it. Oh my gosh. Okay, LinkedIn people, we're still here. My Google people, I think, just got cut off. And yeah, so bear with me just a second as I navigate a tech challenge. Yeah, bear with me just a second. While we're waiting there for me to fix the Google folks, anybody on the LinkedIn have any questions about the introvert extrovert dichotomy, about that preference, about how that preference shows up in leadership? Anybody have a question about that in the chat? All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and press on for the LinkedIn audience because I want to be aware of your time, and my tech issue is not your fault, so we're going to keep moving. By the way, whenever I mention the introvert extrovert dichotomy, and some of you who've been to my live sessions know that there's an example I like to give, which speaks to our ability to lead across difference. And so that is that when I work with groups in person, I often split them into introvert preference folks and extrovert preference folks. And I turn to the people with the extrovert preferences and I ask them a question. I say, how many of you know the phrase resting Mitch face with an M, resting Mitch face? And there's a bunch of blank stares. And so that concept, my other stream is back up, so bear with me just a second. Okay. Hey, Google Meet folks, sorry about that technical glitch right there, but we are back on the Google Meet side, and let me go ahead and share my presentation as well. You didn't miss much at all. So the story I was telling is when I talk with leaders and managers about extroversion and introversion in person, I'll break them into two groups, and I'll often ask the leaders who have an extrovert preference, how many of them are familiar with the phrase resting Mitch face with an M? Overwhelmingly, they're not. There is one comedian that used that phrase once, I think, but overwhelmingly not. But we know what the phrase resting Mitch face rhymes with. We know what it rhymes with because there is a stereotype that is used on women who happen to have introvert preferences and whether they are smiling enough for the office or for one person in the office. And so one way to increase your emotional intelligence using the Myers-Briggs or Jungian psychology is to understand that if there are women in your office who have a reputation of being disengaged or being unfriendly, that they may simply have an introvert preference and that's it. It's not to say that there couldn't be someone who's unfriendly, but women with introvert preferences deal with these stereotypes, right? And women come in lots of different races and lots of different ability statuses and all these different things. So all women deal with this stereotype to some degree. And then if you're a Black woman, if you're a Latina woman, there are bonus stereotypes that I hear a lot, right? When I'm thinking about Black women who are quiet or don't smile enough, I often hear people say they have an attitude, right? And again, this is most likely just a woman trying to live her life, a Black woman, a Latina woman trying to live their life. And if they happen to be introverted and not smiling every time they see you, you don't need to make commentary on that. So the commentary on that is not important, right? So again, let women who have introvert preferences just be themselves. Don't use RBF as a phrase. Don't assume that they are aloof or standoffish or have an attitude. Just let women who have an introvert preference just be themselves. I've been alive for 51 years, y'all. 51 years. No stranger has ever said to me, "Oh, honey, you need to smile more." No stranger has ever said that to me. Because now I'm an extrovert. I have an extrovert preference, but I'm a man, right? Men who are introverts overwhelmingly don't have our smiles and our faces managed by people. It's just not a thing. I think a little bit there are some some stories I hear among Black men in particular where that happens a little bit, but it's endemic when it comes to how we treat women in the workplace. So that's an example. So the next dichotomy is intuition and sensing. So when you think about leading with emotional intelligence, I talked for a minute about active listening and making people feel heard. Active listening and making people feel heard. And again, active listening is a skill all people can develop. People with introvert preferences and extrovert preferences. People with introvert preferences may have a little easier time developing the active listening skill. And then making people feel heard is a second skill. And anybody can do that. People with extrovert preferences may have an easier time learning that skill. But I'm talking in that first dichotomy, the extrovert introvert dichotomy, about active listening and maybe making people feel heard. But what about when it's your turn to talk? What happens when you have actively listened? You've given the person you're listening to some cues, non-verbally, verbally, however, to make sure that they are feeling heard, because your team members want to feel heard, not just be heard. They want to feel heard. And now it's your turn to talk, and you need to talk to them about something. Maybe it's a difficult conversation. Maybe it's just coaching them on a new project. Maybe it's just talking about an ongoing project and how to maintain it. The second dichotomy of the Myers-Briggs, or the second dichotomy that Jung brings to our attention, is intuition and sensing. You'll notice I use the capital N on the slide there for intuitive. But ultimately, and if you've been in my workshops, you're probably familiar with a picture that I show people. And it's a complicated picture. And I put up a picture for a minute and I let people examine the picture. And then I ask everybody to describe the picture. I take the picture off the screen and ask people to describe the picture. People with sensing preferences, are using their senses in a very direct, concrete way. So when they describe the picture, they are describing what they see on the picture. In this case, there's some birds, there's some kids. So they'll say there are 3 blackbirds and 1 bluebird. There are 2 kids sitting on a rhino. There's a woman behind a rock. They are describing what is on the picture. They are cataloging for me the amount of birds, what color they are, the kids, what position they're in, the person behind the rock, what position they're in. They're cataloging the substance of the picture, because sensing people have a preference for using their senses in a direct, concrete way when observing something. Meanwhile, there's a second group of people in the room at all times called the intuitives. They don't describe to me what's on the picture. They tell me what's happening inside the picture, in the picture. They say there's some children going on a journey, and there's a woman behind a rock who's their protector for their journey. Or they'll say there are students in a mystical land, and they're about to be attacked by a woman behind the rock. They'll give context, and they'll try to connect the picture with other iconography they're familiar with. People who studied educational theory, you may have heard of schema. Schema are these ideas that we are always making new categories in our brain, that everything we learn has to either fit one of those categories, modify one of those categories, or build its own new category, right? But that our brain, when we're learning, tries to fit things into pre-existing categories because that's the path of least resistance. It's easiest. And so schema, in other words, what does this thing I'm learning remind me of, or what does this thing I'm observing remind me of, is what intuitive people just have a natural preference to do. So if you've done active listening and it's your turn to start communicating, how might you communicate differently to someone with a sensing preference versus someone with an intuitive preference? How might you communicate differently? When I think about it, first of all, I have to be aware of my own preference. I'm an intuitive. My preference is intuition. When I used to supervise people, I would regularly give them 70% of what I would give them for a project was the context of the project, how the project was impacting other departments, students we served, professionals who we were trying to develop, whatever the case was. I would give them 70% context and 30% nuts and bolts and details of how to do the project. Standard operating procedures, an outline, a report from how it was done before, that kind of thing. 70%, I'm giving them context about why it's important. 30%, I'm giving them how to do it in an outline. Because I'm an intuitive, that's how I do it. People with a sensing preference will find that frustrating. If you have an intuitive preference and you're supervising people with a sensing preference, they will report that you are overly vague. maybe flighty, maybe that you don't have a good grasp on the details. Those are things that you will get that they will say about your leadership. It is very common, right? Similarly, and so as an intuitive person, what I need to do is A, try to get my coaching to them to be more 50-50. Give them a little more detail and a little less context. It's going to be okay. They want a little more detail. They want a little less context. When they're having a tough time, when it's their busy season at work, give them 70% detail and 30% context, because when they're stressed, they need that extra. And when it's their quieter time of the year, if they have a quiet time of year where they have less work to do, less projects going on, challenge them by giving them a project with very little detail and more context and more broad strokes and big picture, but challenge them in that way. And so notice that I'm talking about being intentional. Being an emotionally intelligent leader means being intentional about your understanding of others. And so if I understand that I'm an intuitive and I have people I'm supervising who have a sensing preference, that I need to meet them where they are on the regular basis, give them a little extra of what they need when they're stressed, and then push them to work my way a little bit when they're not as stressed, right? To help them grow. But do this all intentionally. Overwhelmingly, what managers do is if they have an intuitive preference, they'll just give that kind of coaching and supervision to those they supervise, and they'll have to and be like, yeah, you got to deal with it. This is how I supervise. This is how I coach, instead of being more aware. Let's flip it for a second. Say that for example, you're a supervisor who's got a sensing preference, and you have people that you're managing who are intuitive. And as someone who's an intuitive who's been managed by people with sensing preferences, I can go ahead and tell you one of the common experiences of people with intuitive preferences managed by people with sensing preferences is feeling stifled or not trusted or micromanaged. Intuitive people with intuitive preferences by nature, when given a project, want to do some of the exploring of how to do the project as a creative process. It's part of how intuitive people are wired. It's part of how that preference expresses itself. Is I want to be given a project with the broad strokes, understanding how this impacts my organization. Give me enough detail that I'm not going to step in something bad. I'm not going to totally mess it up. But don't give me any more detail than that, because I want to craft the details around this contextual understanding I have. And if you give me too many details, you need to do it this way, this way, this way, this way, this way, I'm going to feel like you don't trust me. I'm going to feel like my style is being cramped. I'm going to feel like I have no agency or license to be creative in the project, right? So even just this dichotomy, and we don't talk about this frequently, but on this dichotomy, everyone with whom you're speaking has one of these two preferences. Now, granted, again, just like I'm right-handed, I use two hands to drive a car. I do, right? I use two hands to type. So it's not as though those you're supervising who have a sensing preference have to have an outline every single time, or those who you're supervising who have an intuitive preference have to have a very deep and broad contextual conversation about how the project impacts their colleagues, their clients, their customers, their students, whomever they're serving. We can drive with both hands, but if you want to be a more emotionally intelligent leader, it means mapping this out and recognizing that half of the people with whom you'll speak have an intuitive preference, half have a sensing preference. If you want to find out what their preferences are, get them to take my course, bring me in and do a workshop, shameless plug, but to try to discern their type so that you can manage them better, right? And discern your type so you can check yourself, right? I'm an extrovert, intuitive, feeling perceiver, ENFP. I lead like an ENFP. I have preference like that. And over time, I've had to teach myself to sometimes be quiet and adopt behavior that people would associate with introversion. A lot of times as an intuitive, I have to stop myself and be like, dude, stop. You need to collect a lot more facts and information on this before proceeding. Because as an intuitive person, sometimes I'll find 2 or 3 facts, think that's enough, and just go with it, right? As a feeler, I'm very concerned with the well-being of those I'm supervising or leading. And so I don't want to not be who I am. But if I have this awareness, then I can recognize, I may be supervising people who are introverts, and I might be overwhelming them with how much I talk to them. I may be supervising people who are sensing, and they feel like I don't I'm not giving them enough detail, and they'll extrapolate to go that I'm not very detail oriented, which is true in my case, but not true of all people with an intuitive preference. But they might kind of think that and think negatively about my leadership, right? Or not want to follow, not want to participate fully in the way I'm leading. Thinking and feeling. Oftentimes, people who are managers who have a feeling preference, especially in the difficult conversations when giving difficult feedback, will overflower things, will say a lot of extra things that aren't the meat or the substance of what we need to talk about. And people with a thinking preference are like, cut to the chase, my friend. Just tell me what's up. I don't need you hemming and hawing. Give me 4 different sentences about how valuable I am and how great I did on this project and this project and this project. I just need you to tell me what I did wrong and how to do it better, right? So understanding this can help. So I think the next slide I've got here, we're talking about thinking and feeling. And again, I sort of segued into that. But I'll give you a real life example. I worked at a university, Appalachian State University in the mountains of North Carolina. And the person, it was not my supervisor, but I had a colleague, and this colleague had previously done the job that I was doing. I don't know if anybody's been in that experience before where you're doing a job and the person who did the job prior is still there. He was in a slightly different area of the department, and we worked together some, but he was an ESTJ. If you're unfamiliar, ESTJ is what Isabella Briggs Myers calls the type A business personality. Extrovert, so there's no question that they're going to get their energy from the outside and say what's on their mind. Sensing, give me the facts, just the facts. Context isn't as critical usually. Thinking, hey, let's operate. When we need to make a decision, let's operate on logic and principles first, and then we'll map in the good of other people as we go. And then judging, which is there's 2 ways to understand judging. One is a social organizational style, meaning that most of your colleagues who have very neatly organized desks or a special relationship with their to-do list are probably judging. It does not mean judgmental. It means they have an orientation towards closure in an organizational sense. And perceivers who have an orientation towards open-endedness or flexibility or improvisation. And so this guy who used to do my job was opposite me in everything except extroversion. The way we soaked in the world on the sensing intuitive dichotomy was different. The way we made decisions on the feeling thinking dichotomy was different. The way we organized our work, judging and perceiving, was different. And he was micromanaging me, even though he wasn't my boss. He was criticizing my work, because for ESTJ personality types, once they find a way to do something that works and is effective, they will decide it's the best way, and then deviating from the best way is not good management from their perspective. As an ENFP, there is no one right way to do a project. There's probably 5 to 10 right ways to do a project, and the right way is bound by lots of context about the constituents we're serving, what the program's goals are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that frustrated the heck out of this guy, that I was getting in with programs that he had done the same way for years. And I come in and I'm like, yeah, we're going to change that because this way is different. So for one thing, this guy used to hand out like this giant packet. It was 120 sheets of paper, I think. 120 sheets of paper to 300 different club leaders on our campus, clubs, fraternities, sororities, that kind of thing, for this big homecoming competition. And these 120 pages, I think 10 or 12 of them were forms that the students had to fill out for their organizations to turn into our office to say, yes, our club wants to participate in the homecoming parade, or yes, we want to participate in the homecoming blood drive, or whatever. So these were physical forms that they would write and hand in. I started working in this office in 2008, and I said, y'all know we've got the internet now, right? Because what was happening was we'd had to take those forms, and somebody in our office, work studies and office managers, had to type in 120, 10, 12 different forms times 300 different clubs, and that left room for error. It was a lot of human hours. It was a lot of waste, and I got our tech people to make a web form. They let me do it. We made a web form, and we found an innovative solution. And I think that may have frustrated the person who was the ESTJ, who was like, we have this system. We've used this system for 7, 8 years. Why mess with it? Why change it? So understand that. So the thinking and feeling thing, at some point, this person who I thought was a difficult colleague And from my perspective I don't want to say they're difficult to everybody, but from an ENFP's perspective, they definitely were a difficult colleague to work with. And I went to my boss, who was a fellow ENFP, and I said, hey man, how do I talk to this guy? This guy's breathing down my neck. He's criticizing the way I do things. He's saying this is the wrong way to do it. He's criticizing me. And again, and so I go to my boss, I say, how do I deal with this? Tell me, how do I deal with this guy? And my boss said, go down to his office, say, you got a minute, and then hit him straight between the eyes with what your problem is. Just say it. And me, I'm having anxiety. I'm like, because I'm a feeler. And I want, if I'm being greeted with a difficult conversation, I want to be reminded by the person on the other end of the conversation that I still have value, that their criticism of this aspect of my work isn't a criticism of me, the person. As a feeler, sometimes I'll conflate those things. You mix in a little imposter syndrome, you mix in a little low self-esteem, and you've got a cocktail for different needs in a conversation. And when my boss said, you just need to go and just tell them straightforward, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I can do that. Because that's a recipe for disaster. And my boss was like, but for his type, that's what he needs to hear. As a matter of fact, when you hem and haw and avoid the conflict, you're getting less respect because of the way his type expresses itself. So again, that's one of the lessons I had on my journey towards more emotionally intelligent leadership, is that in this instance, we were not simply talking about thinking and feeling, just that third dichotomy. We were talking about a whole type difference where he and I were different in almost every aspect. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But I've got about 2 or 3 more slides, and then I'm going to wrap up. This is something that a lot of people are unfamiliar with when it comes to the Myers-Briggs. There's a guy named David Keirsey who created this thing called the Keirsey temperaments. And I love the Keirsey temperaments. As a matter of fact, one of the things I always warn groups I work with against is using the Myers-Briggs to stereotype people. It is an ineffective use of the Myers-Briggs or any Jung-based assessment to stereotype people based on their preference for introversion or extroversion, or stereotype them on their preference for intuition or sensing, or stereotype them on any of their preferences. But we do need to work as teams, and it would be great if we had a shorthand that was what I call stereotype light. And the Keirsey temperaments are that. They are a grouping of the 16 different combinations you can make in a Jungian-based assessment or the Myers-Briggs. They are a grouping that notices certain commonalities and patterns. So you'll notice in the top left corner, all of the people who share NF in the middle, intuitive feeling, in their middle 2 letters, are called the idealists. Trust me when I say people all across those 4 types expressed there. So introverted idealists or extroverted idealists, idealists who have a judging preference, meaning they love their to-do lists and are more organized typically, or a perceiving to-do list where they kind of go with the flow and their to-do lists are flexible. No matter what this group shares is intuition and feeling. What they share is they are absorbing the world through intuition and making decisions about the good of people first and principles and logic second. Those people, we share a lot of common understanding and a lot of common language. Top right corner, you have the guardians. The guardians don't share 2 middle letters. They share their second and fourth letter, S for sensing and J for judging. That there's a potent combination among people who have S for their second letter and want to absorb the world in outlines, in pieces, look at what's on a picture, not what's in a picture, by preference at least, who also are the J crowd who has a special relationship with being organized. The J crowd often, if they do something that should have been on their to-do list that wasn't, they'll retroactively add it, even though it's already done, so they can have the joy of marking it off, right? Perceivers, meanwhile, almost never do that. I'm a perceiver. I've done that a few times, but it's not built into my preference, right? And so the guardians are the people in your organizations who will always remind you of policy and procedure. The guardians are perceived by the idealists sometimes as dream killers. The idealists still have a dream. The guardians are there to kill the dream. Meanwhile, the guardians are looking at the idealists being like, why are your heads in the cloud? Don't you know? I sent you the handbook to read the policy 3 months ago. Didn't you read it in its entirety? Meanwhile, the idealists are like, no, probably not. Especially the idealists who are P's, the idealists who have P at the end. They didn't read the book. They'll read the book when they need to, up until that point, not before they need to. The idealists who are a J probably did a healthy skim of the book, and the introvert J's probably may have read it, right? But the guardians are like, why don't you know these policies? Why don't you know these procedures? Why are your heads in the cloud? That's very impractical. Meanwhile, the idealists are like, you're killing my dreams. This was supposed to be a brainstorm session, and you've already told me 5 reasons why my idea is not going to work. Why can't we just brainstorm, right? The lower left-hand quadrant are the rationals, the NT, intuitive thinkers. And the NTs often can be a bridge. Now, again, they share the 2 middle letters, kind of like their idealist cousins above. So they share intuition with the idealists, but they have thinking when it comes time to make their decisions. Their decisions are based on principles and rational things first, people-centered decisions second. And so the rationals can be a huge bridge. Rationals tend to connect the big picture with good operational processes, right? Connect the big picture with good operational processes. Are they as adept and comfortable with brainstorming as their idealist cousins? Not as much, but they're okay with it. But when it comes time to move the brainstorm from brainstorm to implementation and planning, that's when the rationals tend to shine, right? And so if you're doing a new project, one of the things I joke about is get the idealists in the room to brainstorm first for 45 minutes first, then bring some rationals in and have those rationals work with the idealists, because the rationals are still intuitives. They still see the big picture. They probably understand the goal in a deep way, how this is going to affect different departments or the constituents we serve. And they're oriented towards logic. How are we going to operationalize this? What are the practical phases we're going to need to do? Then after you bring the rationals in, bring the guardians in to polish it up and get those details lockstep on what department needs what form now to start implementing those. Because if the guardians are there for the first 45 minutes, the idealists inside are dying because their dreams are being dashed, right? And so the rationals play that role. By the way, there's certain types, I should have mentioned this, among the guardians. If you see ESTJ, trust me when I say that if there are particularly women in your organization, who are talked about or perceived of as bossy, I'd bet you even money that they're going to score ESTJ or ESFJ. ESTJ is the most common type that raises the stereotype of bossy women. I'm just being real with y'all. And again, I'm saying this so that we can shut down these stereotypes, because once we understand type, we can just let women who have an introvert preference just not smile at their desk and not bug them about it, right? Or women who are ESTJ, let's use some of the ESTJ men stereotypes and give those to the women, like go-getter, very takes charge, those kinds of things. Men who are ESTJ get these positive things, go-getter, take charge, whatever. Women who score ESTJ, have an ESTJ preference, get bossy, etc., etc. And ESFJ to a lesser extent, but ESFJ and ESFJs on some level tend to be competitive. Extroverted SFJs tend to be perceived as competitive, and probably are some. Introverted SFJs are competitive against themselves sometimes. It's complicated. Similarly, another stereotype that groups that I work with, if I'm ever doing the ACC 10-factor assessment, and there's some open-ended questions in there as well. And anytime I see groups of supervisees talking about their supervisor as someone who mansplains a lot or white-splains a lot, again, even money that they are an ENTJ. We're talking the rationals, the bottom left corner, the NT crowd. But when you take intuition and thinking and put an extrovert on it, on the front end, and J on the back end, that is a recipe for people who have a preference to thoroughly explain their ideas. And if those leaders or managers happen to be men and or white men, the over explaining of the ideas without some other cultural lenses shows up as mansplaining or white-splaining. It just does, right? And so we can talk about the stereotypes about women being bossy in a vacuum, or we can understand it through this. We can talk about mansplaining or white-splaining in a vacuum, or we can try to understand it this way. Because when we understand it this way, we can coach those individuals to work on themselves if there are ways that they can work to be perceived better by those they are supervising, and or work on those they are supervising to work on those stereotypes, right? And then the bottom right-hand quadrant is the artisans. The artisans are some of the most fascinating people to me. So many of the groups I work with are either in education, nonprofit, municipal government, city and county government, that kind of thing. And in those groups, artisans tend to be rare. Artisans tend to be rare. Artisans, I think, flock to professions that are tactile. And so artisans flock to, maybe it's a brick mason, maybe it's a hairdresser, maybe it's a brain surgeon, or things that have a thrill element, right? If you went out to Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School in Lander, Wyoming, and took the Myers-Briggs types of all the people who teach outdoor survival skills, or went to your favorite high ropes or low ropes course or zip line instructor, or those folks who have that kind of visceral, action-oriented aspect to them, odds are pretty good that they are artisans. And one of the things that's great when I zoom back to like planning an event, remember I told you brainstorming, idealists have a natural preference that's going to benefit them in brainstorming. The rationals are a very next important part of the phase because they can help you get from brainstorm to what are the key things you're going to need to plan out. The artisans, if anything you're planning has a physical aspect to it, you're planning an event at a large auditorium, the artisans will say, let's take this meeting over to that auditorium. They'll want to be in it. There was a great scene in the TV show Friends where Joey Tribbiani is in England and he can't get his bearings. And so he says, I need to get in the map. And so he puts the map on the ground so that he can stand in the map to orient himself to where he is. People who are artisans tend to have this preference for doing a physical mapping of their physical environment in ways that the other preferences don't have a preference for, that the other Kiersey temperaments just don't have a natural preference for. That doesn't mean we can't do it. Again, Myers-Briggs and the Jungian psychology is not about what you can do. If somebody said to me, Alan, we're planning an event in this auditorium, and I'm an idealist, and they said, we need you to really go and take a detailed survey of what's in the auditorium, the exits, the chairs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can do it when prompted, but artisans do it just instinctively. It just happens, right? Because it's part of their preference makeup. So similarly, guardians, those SJs that I said can be perceived as dream killers to the idealists, when you get them together and say your charge is to do some brainstorming, they can do it. It's gonna be different than the idealists. It's not gonna be as grand necessarily, and the brainstorms will be pre-limited by what the guardians deem feasible or practical or within policy. So they'll be the brainstorming will be pre-limited, but with that prompt they can do it, right? So understanding these Kiersey temperaments is huge for teamwork, and I just scratched the surface here. And again, shameless plug. If you think to yourself, wow, this is a different way of thinking of the Myers-Briggs, and you're curious, take my course. Just it's I think it's self-paced. You can just go through it. It's through Teachable. Again, when I originally priced it, was $229, which I think was overpriced, and now it's just $40. And so I think there's a lot of value in it. And if you like this conversation, let me know. There's one more thing I want to mention, and this also kind of connects to that course. Isabella Briggs Myers says we each have a blind spot. Now, that language can be perceived as a little bit ableist, right? Using the word blind, but an aspect of our personality that is hard for each of us to perceive, right? Something that's hard to perceive about ourselves. This chart here, again, it's the 4 Kiersey temperaments. If you notice, the colors are the same for those of you who see colors. Top left is the intuitive feelers or the idealists. The top right are the guardians who share S and J. The bottom left are the rationals who share N and T, and the bottom right are the artisans who share S and P. But you'll notice that in each of those quadrants, there's what we call the order of type. And this is one of the most advanced parts of understanding Jungian typology and understanding the Myers-Briggs is the order of type. And I'm not going to, because we're running low on time, I'm not going to get into the whole thing. But know that the thing that you see number 1, if you know your type and you look at this chart, that number 1 thing, that's what they call in Jungian terms, you're dominant. You're dominant. By the way, people with an extrovert preference, that aspect of their personality that's their dominant, they show the world that. They take it out. Everyone knows you as that. Meanwhile, people with an introvert preference, whatever your number 1 is, you share that with your inner circle. You share that aspect, your number 1, with your inner circle. And you take your number 2 and wear it like a mask and show the world that. Your casual work colleagues, if asked to describe you, would focus in on your number 2, your secondary part of your Jungian type. For those who know you the best, your inner circle, know that top aspect of you because you save it for them out of a way to protect your own energy, protect your sanity, whatever. The thing I want to draw your attention to, though, in our last 5 minutes, 6 minutes, is everybody has a number 4, and this is what Isabella Briggs-Myers calls the blind spot, right? Or the thing about ourselves that's hard to perceive. And I hope you listen closely to this, and you can watch the repeat later. If you're on with the Google Meet, the replay will be available on LinkedIn. Your number 4 is a part of you that does not show up when you're having a good day. It shows up when you're under stress. And when you are under stress, it shows up in a juvenile way, waiting to throw a temper tantrum. So let me say it this way. When you're having a really bad day, when you're really stressed, and your mind starts playing tricks on you, and you start catastrophizing, and you start going through certain processes of being in the dumps, trust me when I say, if you can accurately identify your type on this chart, if you've had someone accurately identify your type, and if you're curious about that, let me know, send me an email, whatever, I can help you with that. If your type is accurate, look at that number 4, because trust me when I say that when you're stressed, when you're down, when you're catastrophizing, the flavor and the tone of that catastrophizing is that number 4 on that chart. This is complicated. It's hard to understand a little bit because when we're under stress, we aren't very reflective generally. And so me saying, hey, have you noticed when you're under stress, you behave this certain way? That might be hard to perceive. Because again, Isabella Briggs-Myers called it a blind spot, something you can't perceive, right? And so, but now you are equipped with this knowledge that when you are under stress, your number 4 is going to show up like a juvenile child. I'm going to give you 4 examples of what that means. I hope these examples click. I'm going to try to go pretty quickly, but just to give you an example. If your blind spot or your number 4, your inferior complex is what they call it in Jungian terms. If your number 4 is thinking, what it means is when you're under stress, you may make logical leaps that are juvenile logical leaps. When my oldest kid was young, I used to pick up him and one of his classmates, and one of his classmates was a little girl, and she says, you know, all blonde boys are mean. And I was like, all blonde boys are mean? And the little girl goes, yeah, all blonde boys are mean. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, how do you know that? And she goes, well, Jason and Jeremy are the 2 blonde boys in my class, and they are both mean. Okay, that's logic, right? Which is what people with thinking preferences lean on most heavily, but it's a juvenile version of logic. It's an incomplete juvenile version of logic that's missing, I don't know, for example, everybody in Sweden or everybody in Scandinavia, right? That there are nice blonde people in the world, but a juvenile logic shows up. So if you have thinking as your number 4 and you're under stress, trust me, you are making logical leaps under stress that are juvenile logical leaps, and there's a technique to get out of that. And my course talks about the technique. There's also a book by Gene Kumaro that talks about the technique. So there's technique. For people whose inferior or their number 4 is feeling, feeling is the desire to do, is being person-centered in your decisions. The way I describe this is when my mom was little, she I think she was 6 years old, 7 years old. She decided for her mom's birthday, my grandma's birthday, she was going to bake her a cake before she woke up. Do you know many 6-year-olds who can actually make a cake that's special for someone's birthday and not kind of mess it up? And so my mom, as a 6 or 7-year-old, makes this cake, but what she also does is makes a giant mess in the kitchen. And so my grandmother wakes up and is like, you know what I get to do first thing on my birthday? Clean up a messy kitchen that my daughter messed up, right? So feeling is the idea of being person-centered, but juvenile feeling is trying to be person-centered and missing the mark. So if feeling is your number 4 or you're inferior, then understand that you may, when you're under stress, try to do something for the good of other people and mess it up. What have I done? Thinking, I've done feeling, sensing is mine. And here's an example. If my wife and I have a discussion in January, and then we're having an argument about that same discussion in March, sensing people, if you remember, their preference is a preference for observing the actual details. Sometimes when I'm in my inferior, when I'm under stress, I will throw back in my wife's face, when we had that discussion in January, you said blah, 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 blah. Those were the exact words you used. No, they weren't. Sensing, sensing is not part of my preference type. It's not part of my makeup. It is my inferior complex. So when I'm stressed, i.e., having an argument, I will pretend I'm good at sensing by reconstructing the details of a sentence, and I'm getting it wrong, probably. I'm getting it wrong. As an intuitive, I intuited what the sentence meant in January, filed that into my schema, and am now trying to reconstruct it as though I have a sensing preference, but it's juvenile sensing, and I'm messing up. And then the last one is intuition. And this one, rewind with me, and I have a love-hate relationship with this story, but it illustrates it well. 1950s sitcom gender roles, right? So just imagine we're in the 1950s watching a sitcom, Leave It to Beaver, and all the gender roles are kind of those antiquated gender roles, right? And the wife is vacuuming, and the husband's standing in the kitchen, and the wife sees a commercial on the television for the new Hoover Light vac. She's like, "Oh, the new Hoover Light vac," and she says, "Honey, I sure would like one of those new vacuum cleaners." So the show cuts to commercial, comes back, and we see the guy talking with his buddies. I don't know, they're playing golf or whatever. And the guy says to his buddies, "Hey, fellas, my wife really wants that new Hoover Light vac. She's very excited about that new vacuum cleaner. You know what else, guys? Next week is my 25th wedding anniversary. I've got an idea." And he winks, and the audience laughs. The audience laughs because intuition is taking context of things and putting it together seamlessly. Juvenile intuition is that the audience is laughing because they know that a vacuum cleaner, first of all, isn't a great gift because it implies doing some work. But second of all, is definitely not the right gift for a 25th wedding anniversary, because intuitive folks understand the 25th wedding anniversary to have the context of being a very special anniversary, and a vacuum to have the context of being an appliance for work. And those things should not be bumping up against each other. And the audience laughs, even though this guy is doing a juvenile version of intuition, right? So I hope those 4 examples landed to some degree. I realize we are out of time. And so real quick, this is my book, Leading with Emotional Intelligence. I do have a chapter in the book about using Jungian psychology to lead with emotional intelligence. It's not particularly in depth, but it does help some. It also intersects culture and identity because we have to. And then my online course, I cannot say enough about how proud I am of this online course. I built it 2 years ago. And again, it's priced very reasonably now. If you are curious about, oh, well, Alan said the Kiersey temperaments and he scratched the surface, but I want to know more about how that can help me work with my team, the course is a great thing. Or I mentioned the inferior complex, or the blind spot, as Isabel Briggs-Myers calls it. I mentioned that, but there are techniques on how you can deal with stress. And y'all, I use these techniques. I use these with my family. I use these with coworkers, and they're amazing. Again, just so I don't seem self-serving, you can learn about the techniques in my course. And there's some books by Jean Kummerow, and I have no financial stake in that whatsoever, but Jean Kummerow. And I am hard pressed to remember which of her books goes into these strategies. I think it's type and teams. I think it is. But if you're curious, email me. I can point you in the direction of that book, point you in the direction of that course. But when it comes to stress management, especially if you're a leader who's helping others with stress management, my course or a couple of those books by Jean Kummerow would be invaluable things to check out. Anyway, thank you all so much. Next week, we're going to do our second to last session in this series. So stay tuned. If you haven't RSVP'd on the LinkedIn side, RSVP for next week's session. Hopefully, if you're on the Google slide, the Google Meet side, you're already invited to the next one next week. Otherwise, y'all have an amazing, amazing Thursday. Thanks for joining today. Take care.